What are some theories from the past that scientists got incredibly wrong? Story 1. The Aristotelian interpretation of gravity was that everything was made of four elements: earth, air, fire, water, and everything wanted to return to its core state. So heavy things fall to the ground because they're mostly earth. Burning wood separates the air elements, smoke from the earth elements, charcoal, etc. If you think about the states of matter, gas, air, liquid, water, solid, earth, and plasma, fire, Aristotle's abstractions don't seem so crazy given his time. They're pretty close, but not abstract enough. Also, Aristotle's theory fits with empirical observations. Rocks drop through water. Air in a balloon moves up when pushed underwater, and we can see fire moving up. From our naked eye, it looks like the sun is moving around the earth. So he deduced from his observations that these things each had a home that they tended towards. Story 2. Sterile techniques in medicine. The first doctor who tried standardizing hand washing for surgeons was ridiculed to the point of a nervous breakdown, committed to an asylum, and beaten to death by the guards. To think how many millions of lives were lost unnecessarily throughout history because we somehow didn't figure out that dirty wounds are so much more dangerous than clean ones. Joseph Lister, the person who Listerine is named after, was another early pioneer working on sterile conditions and hand washing. When his sister, maybe sister-in-law, needed abdominal surgery to remove a cancerous cyst from her reproductive system, he performed it on his dining room table at home, because a wealthy person's home was much cleaner and safer than a hospital. He did so with no anesthesia. She lived for multiple years after his intervention. I read a book a while back about Lister called The Butchering Art, and it was pretty neat and informative. One of the main takeaways I got from it was just how hard it is in the beginning to shift accepted practice or change set ways large scale like that. In hindsight, the idea of the medical field at large being widely resistant to antiseptic practices is just bonkers. But at the time, the idea and concept of germs and cross contamination was radical and initially dismissed. Also, when Lister was beginning his career and studying to be a surgeon, I think it was ether, had only been recently discovered or used to knock out patients during surgery, which absolutely revolutionized the surgical field. Prior to this, a good surgeon was a fast surgeon because they had to just work as quickly as they could because there was just no anesthetic. An amputation was more like a race than a careful, skilled procedure. Story 3. My grandfather died during a surgery to remove ulcers from his stomach. At the time, ulcers were believed to be just caused by excess acid in the stomach. Treatment was just palliative, with antacids and diet, until you had to remove the ulcers. It was the widespread belief that bacteria cannot survive in the human stomach due to the acid. Nowadays, he would just take an oral antibiotic for a week and the ulcers would be gone. Penicillin was available at the time. Just that the doctors did not believe that ulcers could be caused by bacteria. Story 4. Historian of science here. One interesting example that comes to mind is the Phlogiston theory to explain combustion and oxidation. Scientists were baffled by these natural processes, and it was a German chemist named Georg Stahl who proposed that combustible compounds contained a substance called phlogiston that was released when they burned or oxidized. After combustion, for example, the smoky air that resulted was phlogisticated air, later known to be mostly nitrogen and carbon dioxide. It was primarily the later work of Antoine Lavoisier that cleared this up. Chemistry was one of the last branches of science to become what we call a mature science, as by the mid 18th century it still clung to Aristotelian ideas and medieval alchemical notions. This case is often held up as a good example of Thomas Kuhn's model of how scientific revolutions actually occur. His book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, is still widely read, and it's the reason that terms like paradigm and paradigm shift are so widely used today. Story 5. I love the idea of miasma theory. Before germ theory, it was thought contagious diseases spread through their smell, like the Black Death spread by the smell of rotting corpses. Also cool to know that those witch doctor men with the long bird beak nose were filled with herbs and spices at the end. The idea was the smells would prevent the doctors from getting sick. Miasma and spontaneous generation theory is still alive and in modern China. I'm not sure if it's Asian culture as a whole, but people in China still talk about bad air, miasma, and think that a cat that doesn't have rabies biting you creates the rabies, spontaneous generation. People will freak out if their own house cat scratches them. I once met a guy in a hospital that was there to get the rabies vaccine because his dog licked a cut on his leg. Story 6. The notion that allergies are psychosomatic. During the 1930s and 1940s, psychiatry was a hot field, and almost nothing was known about immunology. The idea of psychosomatic ailments was intriguing, and several psychiatrists proposed that allergies and asthma were psychosomatic. Physicians responded to childhood asthma and allergies by performing a parentectomy, literally splitting up families and sending children to live in rural group homes. Sometimes a child's health did improve from this. Yet rather than searching for other causes such as mold in the walls of the family's home, the psychiatrists assumed they had rescued those kids from toxic parenting practice. The association of allergic to for something someone didn't like entered popular usage during this era. As a result of some of the things those psychiatrists wrote for the general public, that notion turned out to be nonsense. It got debunked by the late 1960s when microbiologists identified which part of the immune system was malfunctioning. Yet, allergic to Mondays is something people still say, and a substantial share of people with life threatening allergies have been poisoned by family members or acquaintances who were trying to prove that the problem was all in your head. Story 7. Maternal impressionism. The belief that birth defects were caused by the woman either being startled by something or having impure thoughts while she was pregnant. One of the most common examples was the belief that a cleft palate, or hair lip, was caused by a pregnant woman either being startled by a rabbit or having gluttonous thoughts about rabbit meat. But the stories from the days when this was accepted theory can get wild. My favorite was a case of a white woman who gave birth to a suspiciously dark skinned child, but then managed to convince everyone that no, she hadn't been sleeping with one of the slaves. She had just been praying too much to Melchior, the black wise man. What's wild is that the professor who taught me about this would regularly tour the country, giving lectures about maternal impressionism, and she would still have people come up to her afterwards to tell her that no, that really is how it worked. She said it was particularly common to get it in places with large Mormon populations. Story 8. Lamarck's theory, known as Lamarckism or the theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics, proposed that an organism can change during its lifetime in response to its environment, and these changes are passed on to its offspring. According to Lamarck, organisms have an innate drive to become more complex and improve themselves. As they face challenges or demands from their environment, they develop new characteristics or modify existing ones through use or disuse of certain organs. These acquired characteristics are then inherited by the offspring, evolutionary change over time. However, Lamarck's theory was later disproved by Darwin's theory of natural selection, which provided a more accurate explanation of how evolution occurs. Story 9. Thomas Midgley, who invented CFCs that caused incredible damage to the ozone layer and improved gasoline by adding lead to it. Dr. Benjamin Spock, an excellent pediatrician who wrote an excellent book about childcare where he recommended placing babies on their stomachs. As it turned out later, this greatly increases the risk of sudden infant death syndrome. On the other side, Ignaz Semmelweis, he tried to normalize some hand washing before operations and childbirth, but no one listened to him. This three cases demonstrate that in science, only time can say the final word, as probably in everything else. After all, those who burned people in the Middle Ages also thought that they were helping the burnt receive lesser punishments after heavenly judgment. Story 10. The medical field is an absolute crap show. It makes me honestly battle to trust it because in a couple of years, the stuff we are prescribed or common medical procedures will be looked at through future lenses as insane. I mean, in the 50s, they prescribed cigarettes for everything, including pregnancy nausea. The 50s! I mean, just the other day, they put mercury in tooth fillings. It's insane. Not to mention the opioid crisis and other crises created by big pharma trying to make money. Guaranteed your kids and grandkids one day are going to look at you like a slow daft individual for some medical procedure prescription you got today. Story 11. Charles Lyell was instrumental in understanding deep time through the principles of geological gradualism, the theory of uniformitarianism, the present is the key to the past, which opened up our understanding of the formation of Earth. However, he went all in on this thinking and rejected any suggestion that sudden catastrophic events had ever occurred in Earth's history. Due to his theory's usefulness, for generations, scientists adopted his thinking and the very suggestion of a catastrophic extinction event, like what we now understand wiped out the dinosaurs, was dismissed as complete fantasy. Story 12. Plate tectonics, originally known as continental drift. Huge resistance, especially in the US. An entire conference was convened in the 1920s entirely to present papers showing what a stupid idea it had to have been. Geologists didn't think a meteorologist like Wegener, despite having been on a number of polar geological expeditions, could possibly know what he was talking about. And it didn't help that his evidence was misunderstood, for instance. It was pointed out repeatedly that the shorelines didn't match up as neatly as he claimed. Well, that's because he had made that claim not about the contemporary shoreline, but the ancient ones, based on minerals found a certain distance offshore. As noted in another comment, it took a few decades for enough evidence to come in and convince everyone. Well, almost everyone. Even in the 80s, a few prominent skeptical geologists got themselves cover stories in Popular Science and other such magazines for interviews talking about problems with the theory and why we still aren't convinced. Further back in geology, there was a 19th century debate between the volcanists, who thought all rocks originated in volcanoes, and Neptunists, all rock formed on the ocean. In the early going, both sides were not above fudging or faking data and then accusing their opponents of the same. Today, while the research done by the Neptunists has proved invaluable to our understanding of sedimentary rock, the volcanists have clearly won. Story 13. When I was growing up, science said that there was no evidence of planets outside our solar system. They said that there was no life other than on Earth. They said the universe was much younger than they say now. Fat was not a food group. It was something to avoid. Eggs were not good for you. Cold fusion was a farce. The Earth was getting colder, and we were headed straight into an ice age. The ozone could never recover. We would run out of oil by the 1980s, 1990s, the 2000s. Cloning was science fiction. History is full of science that has been proven wrong. It is the nature of science. Some things hold up over time, some things don't. Story 14. Aristotle's theory of spontaneous generation is one of the most classical debunked theories of biology. The theory stated that life, which included all living organisms, plants and animals, could come from a non-living body. This means a living organism can be produced through a spontaneous reaction from a non-living reactant. Lastly, he believed this could only be possible if the living matter contained something he called pneuma, which translated to vital heat. He used the famous fish eel and frog experiment in an attempt to prove the consistency of his theory. Story 15. That smoking cigarettes was good for you, or at the very least, that it can fit into a healthy lifestyle, sort of like the occasional glass of wine. What's interesting is that a lot of people 100 plus years ago were campaigning against cigarettes, but for the wrong reasons. For example, if young girls do it, it won't be very ladylike. Pretty much all of the data we have about cigarettes causing cancer and or heart disease and or aging are very new. Newer than a lot of people. Same with drinking while pregnant. Story 16. Luminiferous ether. After the whole light as a particle or light as a wave argument came down in favor of light as a wave, people started asking what sort of medium is the light wave transmitted in. If you think about it, all other waves are transmitted through a substance. Solids, rope, steel, or rock in the case of earthquakes. Liquids, water is the obvious example. Or gases, and generally, the stiffer the substance, the faster the wave. People already knew that light was very fast, and it could apparently pass through empty space, which waves are not supposed to be able to do. So this astonishing substance, called ether, was theorized, something that was fluid enough to fill all space, yet was amazingly rigid to support the high frequencies of light waves. It had to be massless, transparent, without viscosity, or else it would impart an observable drag on planets, and incompressible, and all these things at once. The thing is, nobody could really wrap their heads around the concept of a wave just going off into empty space. Even an electromagnetic wave, as all people knew back then, is that to create a varying electric field, one needed electrically charged matter. Increasingly complex experiments were devised to detect the ether, with all the experiments producing null results, no detection. But as experiment after experiment kept on producing null result after null result, the theories about what ether was and how it interacted with the universe got wilder and wilder. It took Einstein's development of special relativity and his explanation of the photoelectric effect by reimagining light as a series of particles with a wave-like nature for the ether theory to truly be killed. Story 17. Socialism. More specifically, a centrally controlled or state-run economy. That's the boogeyman that warranted all the propaganda fed to the boomers during the Cold War. Even Lenin started getting away from it when he found out it didn't work. There's a good argument that China's more capitalist than the West at this point. Economists have come a long way since the 1800s, and it's a shame that the CIA didn't let Chile experiment with a computer aided central economy. But it's generally accepted that free markets are much better at adapting to change because they're powered by our vastest resource greed. Story 18. A corollary question would be, which currently accepted theories do you think might be overturned in the future? Something like the current amyloid plaque model for Alzheimer's, or maybe string theory. My mother's a microbiologist, and her best guess for the next biology revolution is in the effect of microbiomes on health. Stuff like people having surgery to have a bunch of intestines removed and their diabetes goes away before their weight changes, or mental health problems change way faster than current models predict they should, pointing to the need to better understand gut flora's effect on health, or the theory of Alzheimer's being related to an immune response to dental health or something in the blood. Modern physics theories feel like guesswork to me too. I figure eventually we'll get much better models, something to explain the link between inertia and gravity, or dark matter and energy, or why rubbing things creates a charge. Story 19. In the 1920s, astronomers believed that the stars were made of the same elements as the Earth in roughly the same proportions. They naturally assumed this because the spectrum of stars showed heavy elements like iron and calcium. Therefore, it was believed that heating the Earth's crust to incandescence would produce similar spectra to our Sun. However, the Sun is 90% hydrogen and helium. It was first discovered by Cecilia Payne, who ultimately wrote a PhD thesis titled Stellar Atmosphere, and is widely considered one of the finest ever written in astronomy. Story 20. Those atoms were like tiny solar systems, with electrons moving around the nucleus in orbits. Those protons were fundamental particles that did not have internal structure, like quarks and gluons. That electricity and magnetism were different things. That gravity acted instantly across any distance. That planets orbited the Earth then. That planets orbited the Sun in perfect circles. There was a simple mathematical formula for the distance from the Sun to each planet's orbit. That the asteroid belt was the remains of a planet. That the Sun generated light and heat from a chemical process. That the Andromeda Galaxy was a star cluster within the Milky Way galaxy. That the universe was always the same size, that new matter came into existence throughout space to balance matter moving apart, that the Big Bang was an explosion, that the universe might eventually contract, the black holes were undetectable and eternal, that radioactivity was harmless, that hand washing was unnecessary for doctors who were gentlemen. Those cats spread the Black Plague. Story 21. I like to think of science as a collection of models. Models are simplifications of reality, used for predictions of behavior in the future and for explaining the past. All models have certain domains they are better suited for, and drawbacks. A model may be something abstract like a formula or a diagram, or it may be something more physical like a tool or a physical likeness, like how we model large floating structures with smaller models in wave pools. Models are never right or wrong, but differ in how useful they are in certain situations, both in terms of how good approximations they are of the aspects of reality you are interested in, but also in how easy they are to use in your scenario. A model that is prohibitively expensive to use, for example, in terms of computational time or money needed to build it, is certainly not useful, no matter how good an answer it would have given you. Some models may fall out of use as newer models that are more useful supplant them, but that doesn't make the original model wrong, just less useful than what came after, story 22. Other people have done a good job of addressing whether theories should be considered true. I read this question as asking whether in practice scientists do consider theories to be true. In that case, I think it depends a lot on the field. Psychologists tend to have a pretty high degree of doubt on existing theories, and for good reason. Sample sizes are small, and evidence is very open to interpretation. Physicists, by contrast, may think that there's something incorrect in some parts of a model, but are much more likely to think the theory says something fundamentally true about the world. One of my physics professors told me that consciously he believed the whole thing about no model being true, that all models are wrong, but some are less wrong, etc., etc. But he didn't really believe it in his heart, because if he didn't believe that he was discovering something real and true about the world, then he wouldn't have become a physicist. I suspect this is true of a lot of physicists. I can give you a little insight as a physicist. Newton's laws of motion describe how things move pretty well. They are simple and worked and are likely the first tool you would use to solve projectile motion. But they aren't the whole story. As soon as your projectile becomes a satellite, we'd turn to Lagrangian classical mechanics. Much easier, and you can get a far more precise solution, but not precise enough for GP. For that, you need general relativity, which is more correct as far as position and timing of your projectile satellite. That doesn't mean that Newton's laws are wrong, just that we now understand a lot more about motion. If I want to know how long it'll take me to drive somewhere, I could use general relativity. I could use classical mechanics, but I don't. Story 23. This is a phrase we are constantly exposed to and has given rise to a lot of anti science. Anti vax, flat earth, climate change denial. While it is true that scientific theories have been disproven or replaced in the past, it is far more likely that scientific knowledge just needs to be modified following new evidence. A lot of our data on sociology and psychology comes from first world universities, and that has warped the views of those areas of study. But they are not completely wrong, they just don't have a full picture. Finally, we are starting to recognize bias, so it can be fixed. But I imagine there are lots of scientific theories that follow this pattern of not being wrong entirely, just limited in scope. Story 24. I think there are two important points to be made. The necessity of pragmatism. In order to move forward, intellectually, technologically, what have you, we must entertain as true what our currently available data indicates as true. This does not mean we must blindly accept popular truths or not hold a critical eye on everything, even that which we hold dear. But rather it is that we must be able to say, okay, accepting this as true or good enough, and move forward. Otherwise, we become paralyzed by indecision. There is a need which is currently lacking in modern society to be able to accept that we were wrong without taking it personally. That does not mean we should be quick to abandon previously held truths in light of some scrutiny or contradiction. But we need to be more fluid in our acceptance of what is true based on ever changing information. For instance, take the discussion on gender and how it has changed or is changing, along with progress in anatomy, genetics, and psychology. What was previously held as a firm truth, gender is binary based on anatomy, became gender is binary based on genetics, and is now becoming gender is a spectrum based on an interplay of anatomy, genetics, and psychology, and may be divorced from one, if not all, of those fields. Story 25. The scientific theories are not unchangeable, unquestionable dogmas, though. They are predictive models that have a margin of error. As we learn more and observe more, the models become more accurate, and the margin of error shrinks. It never fully disappears, but it is impractical to think that the current margin on, say, the theory of evolution is equivalent to the margin of error on how plague doctors cured people with burning sage and leeches. There is a clear difference in the level of scientific understanding that forms the basis for exactly how our beliefs and knowledge base today is fundamentally different from medieval methodology.